Hello class. So this week we are going to do a Roman portrait bust, and so I'm just going to quickly do an overview of the materials that you'll need. The first thing I asked you to get was this. It's Super Sculpey Medium Blend, and Super Sculpey is a polymer clay that bakes in the oven. So this is how the Sculpey comes in its box when it's brand new. It comes in these bars that are scored so that you can easily peel them off to get as much as you need. So you're going to need your clay. You'll probably need a scrap of wood to use as a base. This isn't required, but it makes it a lot easier when you're building it if you can just plant it onto a block of wood. You can move it around and turn it without getting your hands all over it. And when you're done working, if you need to use the workspace for something else, you can just pick it up and take it somewhere else. So this is kind of a handy thing to have. You'll need some aluminum foil. We're going to use this to create the bulk mass of the head, and that will help us to save clay first of all, but it will also help the model to bake evenly when we're done with it and ready to bake. So we'll need aluminum foil, and then I have various clay tools that some of them will be helpful. Some of them you may not need, but I'll show you some of the more useful ones. The first is going to be a loop tool, and this is just a tool with a wooden handle that has a metal loop, sometimes it's a wire loop on it, and this is for carving away or removing material. That's very handy for that. Another one that I've found pretty useful is this kind of a rubber tool. It's got a rubber point on it and kind of a wedge-shaped spatula on the other end. A pair of calipers. These are going to be useful for if you're building your head model to scale to a drawing. So one thing that isn't required but that is very helpful is to take some head reference photos and print them out. You can use a mirror if you want for reference, but this is going to be a lot easier obviously because with a mirror you can't get a good side view of your head. So this would be helpful for that. So I took some reference photos. I made sure that they were side by side and that the details lined up. For instance, my chin and mouth and nose and hairline and the top of your head, everything's lined up. That makes it easier to tell that they're both to scale. So the calipers are useful for if you're building your model to the same scale as your paper printout, which this looks about right, I think. Maybe about 4 inches tall, 5 at the most. You don't want it to be huge because you don't have that much clay, and you don't want it to be too small because then doing the details will be really difficult. So the calipers are useful for taking measurements from your paper and transferring them to your model. So these are not necessary, and there are ways that you could probably manage making your own calipers with, for instance, just a piece of wire or something that you bend. But they're kind of handy to have. And aside from the clay tools that I already showed you, there's any number of household items that you would probably find useful at some point. Toothpicks can make good sculpting tools. I have a couple of wooden tools that are fairly useful. This one has kind of a spoon shape. This one's just kind of sharpened to a small point, and it has sort of a flat rake on the other side. So that's about all you'll need for materials. So let's get started. So the first thing that we're going to do is take your aluminum foil and you're going to make a firmly packed ball with it. Because this is going to serve as the basis for your head mass. And I'm going to compare it to my paper and make sure that it's narrow enough that I'm not going to be anywhere near the surface once I start putting clay on it and carving back into that clay. So once you have your head mass and it's about the right shape that you think you need it, you can set that aside. The next thing we need to do is to get your clay to a workable state. So what you're going to have to do is peel off maybe about a half of a layer of this brick at a time. Say 3 or 4 bars worth at a time, and just start kneading it. Squeeze it in your hand, smush it up, work it together, and rub it. Basically, you just have to make it pliable. And it'll do that once you start moving it around and once it starts absorbing your body heat. It will get to a pliable state. So once you have a lump that is kneaded and ready to go, you can set it aside and work on another lump. Okay, so it's been about 20 minutes and I've got a good sized lump of clay kneaded. This is a little more than half of my 1 pound brick of clay. And judging from my paper, I'm thinking this might be enough clay. If I have to knead more and add it to the lump, that's fine. So between shots I noticed that because I had this long thick neck that I'm also going to sculpt, since I'm going to do a portrait bust, it's not just going to be a decapitated head. It's going to include for sure the neck and probably part of the shoulders. So I wrapped some pieces of foil around the whole head and then squished them towards the bottom to make sort of a neck. And that's going to do for the neck part the same as it's going to do for the head. It'll help it bake a little bit more evenly, but it'll also give this some rigidity so the neck won't be quite so bendy. So what I'm going to do is just start taking my clay, pinching off pieces, and applying it to my head form. And you're going to want to try and make sure you don't get any air bubbles trapped in your clay. It won't make any difference in the baking process, but if you have a lot of air bubbles trapped underneath in between your clay and the foil armature, it's going to make it, you'll be able to feel that there's a bubble. It'll be kind of mushy there, where you want it to be kind of firm. So as much as possible, try to work out those bubbles and get the clay stuck as firmly to the foil as possible. And that's why it's important also that you have your foil packed pretty tightly, because you don't want it to be smushing while you're trying to press clay into it. And it's a good idea to be checking your progress against your printout while you're working, so that you know which areas need to be built up more. So once you have all of your clay on, you should have something that looks like this. I've kind of roughed out the shape of the shoulders where I want it to be sliced off, and added some clay to the bottom and stuck it down onto the board. And it should stick there pretty firmly without you having to screw it down or anything, or fix it permanently. So for me, that's a good enough hold to keep working on it. Judging by how much clay I have left, a lump about this size, I'm going to be cutting it pretty close. So if you have like if you have a lot of hair or something that's going to increase the size of this sculpture, and you're going to need more clay, you might want to scale yours down just a tiny bit from what I have here, so that you don't run out of clay. So from this point, it's just a matter of adding on to it to get the basic shape of the features of my head. So I'm going to start by kind of, pressing in the eye sockets, adding material for the nose, the chin, adding some more to the back of the head, adding the ears, and so on. So I'm just going to keep working away at this, and I'll talk to you later. So some general tips for sculpting a portrait are to start with the general shapes and then move to more specific. So we started with basically just an egg shape, and then I found the brow ridge and the nose. And now I'm starting to add little lumps of clay onto the face to build it up to the depth that I think it needs to be. So I'm not worrying about right now smoothing everything out and making it look finished. I'm just taking little lumps of clay and pressing them on. And I don't even have to flatten them out or smooth them down yet. I'll just keep doing it until it looks like it's about the right depth that it needs to be. Then when I get it pretty close, then I can start smearing it down like I did on this side. So I'm using this kind of rounded spatula tool. You could probably use a spoon or something like that too. Just kind of take those lumps of clay and smooth them out and find those planes. Another thing that I didn't mention earlier, when you are building your head shape and neck shape, you want to make sure that you get this nice curve or angle to the neck. Because when you look at a neck and a head, what you don't see is a ball with a stick coming out vertically from the bottom. The spine actually comes up at an angle like this and attaches to the back of the skull here below the ears. So you'll get this curve even when you're standing straight and you think that your posture is very vertical. So make sure that you get this angle in there, at least to a certain degree, because that will help a lot with the believability. So I've got my sculpture mostly finished now, and honestly, if you bring it to this point, you don't even have to go into all this detail, like in the hair and eyebrows and things, if you don't want to, and it is kind of time consuming. So as long as you've brought your bust to a finished state and you photograph it, that's good enough for an A. But if you want to take it beyond that to kind of a polished professional level, then there's a couple of things you can do. First of all, you can take, in order to get all the fingerprints and lumpy parts smoothed out on your model, you can use something called Bestine, which is a rubber cement thinner, or you can use denatured alcohol, which you can find at any kind of a hardware store. Even at Walmart you can get this stuff. And it's a mild solvent. And what you can do is take a brush, probably use one that you don't care that much about. I've got a little bit of denatured alcohol in this baby food jar. Wet your brush. You can smear it, brush it onto the surface. And what it does is it just dissolves a very thin layer of the clay and lets you smooth it with the brush. Now we can get rid of little imperfections and fingerprints and things like that. So again, this is kind of advanced for what you need to do for the project. This is not a requirement, but if I was sculpting this for posterity, which I kind of am, then I would want it to look as nice as possible. The thing that this solvent is really good for is, if you see these little pieces of clay that have been caught in the surface, using the solvent is really good for getting rid of those. You can see they just kind of brush away or dissolve back into the clay. So now that the sculpture is finished, it's time to bake. Okay, so the last step in finishing your sculpture, portrait bust, is going to be baking it. Now, you'll notice on the box there are baking directions, but it's probably a good idea to ignore these. It seems like every time you follow these directions, 275 for 15 minutes per 1/4 inch of thickness. So for instance, if we followed the directions, we'd probably put this in the oven at 275 for 20 or 30 minutes. But the problem is, at that heat, the extremities tend to get burnt. So like the nose and the ears and things like that. So to keep it from getting burnt, I'm going to take it off the wood block now and put it directly on the cookie sheet. And I'm going to put it in the oven cold. And what you want to do is to slowly raise the temperature to about 200 degrees and leave it there for 15 or maybe 20 minutes, and then slowly bring it back down. And that's going to reduce the chance that it's going to crack or break, but more importantly, it'll reduce the chance of it burning. I'm going to first turn it to 170 because that's the lowest temperature it'll let me do. And then 15 minutes at a time, I'll slowly turn it up to about 200. And I probably don't want to go any higher than 250. But I'll try it at 200 first, and then we'll slowly bring it back down to temperature. So this is my finished portrait bust, and it's baked and came out of the oven now. I ended up leaving it in the oven for, in total, about an hour and a half, I think. So I slowly brought it up from 175, which was the minimum temperature that the oven would allow me to set it at. And I slowly brought it up to about 220, 10 minutes at a time. And once it got to 220, I left it there for about 10 or 15 minutes. And then I turned it off and just let it cool in the oven. So I didn't pull it out of the oven right away. I let it stay in the oven and slowly cool down as the oven reached room temperature. So once you pull it out, you should have a fairly hard clay bust. It should have the consistency of a hard wood. And this finished product, this surface, is sandable and paintable. So if you felt like you still had some imperfections that you wanted to get rid of, you could take some fine grained sandpaper and sand it. And you can also paint it or seal it however you like. So I hope you enjoyed this project, and I look forward to meeting you on the next project.